Hey, deserving listeners. So in this episode, I just want to explain the differences between the YouTube membership program on YouTube and the patron membership program on Patreon. And I've taken some notes to keep me on track. So we started the YouTube membership program about a year ago, I think. And we've used this past year as a time to gather data. And during that time, I experimented with different kinds of perks for the members. I also experimented with different amounts of time expenditure for myself to see what worked. I also asked for feedback, and people provided their feedback. And me and my wife, over time, over this past year, have occasionally sat down and thought about where we're at and what we want to do moving forward. And recently, we established a pretty firm plan into the future, and I wanted to explain that to you all. So long story short, if you don't want to watch this full video, the plan is to continue doing what we have basically been doing for a while, which is that becoming a YouTube member will get you access to exclusive YouTube video content, and becoming a patron will get you access to exclusive audio podcast content. And the Patreon side, it's always been that way since 2015, since we started on Patreon. With the YouTube side, I've kind of been trying to figure out what that is. But for a while now, we've had this in place, and we're going to continue with that plan. And so the rest of this video is just an explanation of how we got to that plan. And so originally, when I first heard about the YouTube membership program, I think a few years ago, I didn't really think it was in the cards for Psychology in Seattle because we were already on Patreon, so it just seemed like a redundant thing. Also, I don't like having multiple accounts. I've always resisted. Since I started the podcast in 2008, I have resisted opening every single account that we've had, Instagram, Facebook, all that kind of stuff. When I started the podcast in 2008, I just wanted an RSS feed. I just wanted the audio podcast feed to go to your phone, your podcast catcher. And I didn't want a website, but people were yelling at me and saying, you got to have a website. I was like, okay, I'll have a website. And then people are like, you got to start a Facebook account. And I'm like, how about you start one for me? And then someone started one for us. And then eventually we took it over. Twitter, I went back and forth, finally shut that thing down. And even with YouTube, I didn't want to go on YouTube. But a student of mine in 2009 said she liked the podcast, but she didn't like the way that you get podcasts. She said, young people, they listen to stuff on YouTube. And I thought, why would I upload audio podcasts to YouTube? That seems so strange. But she kept badgering me about it. and so I thought, okay, fine. I mean, she's younger, so maybe she knows. And so I started the YouTube channel just because of her. And, it seemed like something that was worth it over time. And so when I first heard about the YouTube membership program, I just thought, not for me. But many within the YouTube audience, they would ask for it. People would comment or email in and say, hey, we would like to support what you're doing here, but we don't really want to go to Patreon because we're not really listeners to the audio podcast. We want to support what you're doing on YouTube, so you should have a YouTube membership program. But again, I just thought, well, I don't know. I don't like multiple accounts. It just seems like a confusing thing. But some people in the audience started to sell me on the idea of having a YouTube membership program in addition to having the Patreon thing, because there were people on YouTube that wanted exclusive content on YouTube. And I'd never really considered that, of making exclusive videos. I'm oriented towards deep dives on Patreon as something that's valuable to people that they'd be willing to pay money for. I never thought that people would want to pay money to have me watch a particular TV show or a particular documentary or something. And so that hadn't crossed my mind, but people were suggesting it. Also, some people within the YouTube community, they wanted a smaller core community. Like on Patreon, the audio podcast, there's a much bigger audience than the patrons, right? But on Patreon, there's a paywall there. So there's a smaller community. It's a more cozy community. And so on YouTube, there were people that were saying, well, we want that not on Patreon. We want it on YouTube. We want to have a core YouTube community of psychology in Seattle. So that was another selling point. And so there were a few other points. And by the way, thanks everyone for giving me this feedback. Also, thank you to the patrons because I wouldn't be here if it weren't for them. So in response to those requests over the last number of years, we started to brainstorm what a YouTube membership program could look like. And the first thing that we came to was to think about the YouTube channel as almost like a different business than the audio podcast. I traditionally never saw it that way because it was always an audio podcast that just happened to be on YouTube. But over the years, occasionally I would make a video that was not on the audio podcast. In the early days, it was rare that that would happen. But I would do that every once in a while. And then when the YouTube channel took off in its own right at the beginning of the pandemic, when I started watching Love Is Blind, then I was still in that mindset of like, well, it's still just an offshoot of the audio podcast, but it really isn't, right? It's a completely different thing, completely different content, different style. It's video. It's video oriented, right? It's hard to listen to that. You have to see the clips, or it's better to see the clips. And so I was basically in denial of the fact that it was very much a different business, or at least a completely different vibe, a completely different audience. And Stacy would tell me this sometimes. She would say, you might want to have the YouTube channel its own business, like a separate business account, that kind of thing. And I thought, again, I don't like having multiple accounts. I don't like having multiple email accounts. I don't like having multiple bank accounts. I get overwhelmed with stuff like I don't like it's almost like clutter in a way. And so I just want everything to be in one camp. And so I resisted that. And it is still just one business. It's just Psychology in Seattle. But in a way, it is a completely different business. On the audio side, it's a different vibe. I have my co-hosts with me often, and that's very different. Sometimes people from the YouTube side, they'll listen to an audio episode, and I'll be surprised that in the comments section, people will say, "Who's this Umberto guy?" And I'm thinking, who's Umberto? He's been around from the beginning. He's part owner of Psychology. Who's Umberto? What are you talking about? But it's different audiences. It's a different group of people, different preferences, different experiences. And one of the ways that I started to think about it was that it's almost like two different restaurants. You have the podcast, the audio podcast, that is more cozy. There's not as much traffic, but the people that come in are more regulars. They're more loyal. They might come every day and eat, like Cheers, the bar on Cheers, right? It's just a core group of people that come every single day. And it's more mellow on that side. And there's not a lot of foot traffic that walks by the restaurant and just randomly comes in. Then the YouTube channel is a different kind of restaurant where there are some loyal people, but there's a lot of passersby who are just walking in off the street and might just come to that restaurant once, or might even just walk in the door, look at the menu, go, not for me, and walk out. And there's a lot more volume, and the menu has to be more generally appealing, probably. I don't know if that exactly scans, but you get my point. It's different. And to consider it all to be one restaurant is confusing to the audience and to me, frankly. Now, some customers might like one restaurant and not the other. Some might like both restaurants. Some might like one restaurant 80% of the time and the other one 20% of the time. And thinking of it that way kind of helps me to figure out how to move forward. So one of the major areas that I kept coming back to when trying to answer this question as to whether or not the YouTube membership program would harm or benefit the audience was work-life balance for myself. How do I allocate my time? If you've heard me talk about this in other episodes, you know that I've been struggling with that ever since the beginning of the pandemic. When the lockdown happened, I had all this extra time to do whatever. I actually liked the fact that I was working 80 hours a week because I wanted something to do because there wasn't anything to do. But of course, eventually we were able to not be under lockdown and do other things and see people and maybe go to a movie or something. And yet I was still working 80 hours a week, about 75 hours a week. And that was not going to work. But because I'm such a dedicated, loyal person, when I make a commitment to something like that, that I couldn't scale back. I thought, well, I committed. And even though the audience wasn't really asking me to do this, I thought, well, I've already committed to this pattern of 2 reaction videos every day. Well, again, during the lockdown, that wasn't hard to do. Eventually, it was way too much. And people would say, Kirk, go ahead and slow down. We don't need you to drive yourself into an early grave, which incidentally, it could do that, right? It takes a toll on everything, Anyway, so I thought maybe the YouTube membership program could help with that somehow. And the way that I thought it might be able to help was that as I scale back on YouTube, which you might have noticed that there are times outside of the Love is Blind seasons, I will publish 2 or 3 episodes a week instead of 14 videos a week. And of course, that's in addition to all the audio podcasts that we publish. So on a typical week over the last number of years, we would publish 20 episodes a week because there would be the 14 or so reaction videos, there would be the 5 audio podcasts, and there would usually be some other stuff in there somewhere. That's a lot of content. And the content is edited a lot, and especially the audio podcast, I'm spending a lot of prep time on that kind of stuff. So it's completely unsustainable. And I thought, well, when we scale back to on YouTube, because that was really the only thing I felt like I could scale back on, and I resisted it for years. I said, I don't want to, and so I would scale back other things. Like I closed the Twitter account, and I closed actually Discord, and I closed other kinds of things that it was painful to do. But I just thought, I don't want to scale back on content. Eventually, I had to scale back on content, and so I scaled back occasionally on YouTube to 2 or 3 episodes a week. And that helped. But what that does is that drastically reduces money and revenue and my ability to pay my bills. It certainly gives me a lot of anxiety about it. And so I thought, well, I wonder if the YouTube membership program could make up for some of that a little bit. In the same way that Patreon gave me this ability in 2015 when I started Patreon, maybe what the YouTube membership program could do is I could spend my time tailoring my content to a core audience that was willing to support my ability to pay my bills and to provide that very tailored content to a smaller group of people. Maybe that would give me the overall ability to scale back on time, but my overall ability also to pay my bills, if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. So I wondered if that was possible. Also, just giving me the ability to know what I should do with my time. Because, for me, if I was left to my own devices, I would watch all the shows you want me to. I would cover all the topics. I would do all the deep dives. But I've realized over the last few years that if I don't put major limits, if I don't impose limits on myself, I'll work myself into an early grave. I'll work 80, 90 hours a week. I mean, even the 80 hours a week, I would still have to have willpower to say, no, don't go down that rabbit hole of content making because you need time to do other things. And I just love making content. I just want to learn and experience and interact. I love doing this. So if it were up to me, I'd be doing it, but I have to limit myself somehow. And so one of the ways to limit myself is to make priorities. And one of the ways to make priorities is to say, well, who are the paying customers? So using the restaurant analogy, like a pizza restaurant, right? If I just went on the street or went online and said, what sort of pizza should I offer this month as a special or something? And the dominant response is Hawaiian pizza. So then I make that a priority, and then I open my doors and no one buys the Hawaiian pizza. Well, that's important information for me to know, right? Because if you just ask everyone something, the data will reflect that you're asking everyone. But if you actually watch what people are willing to spend money for in your restaurant, that could be different. It might not be. It might be the same, but it might not be. And so when having a YouTube membership program, it would be along those lines. If I just ask everyone or I respond to requests, that's one set of requests. And that's important. I still value that greatly. But it's also interesting and important for any business to know, well, among the people that are that dedicated to your product, that they're willing to pay money for it, what are they asking for, right? And over time, just to let you know that I'm going to be listening to both audiences. I'm going to be listening to the overall YouTube audience, and I'm also going to be listening to the membership audience and figuring out how to move forward. Like with couples therapy, I was getting a lot of requests, but from a smaller group of people. When I put out a poll to everybody, they wouldn't request couples therapy. But over the years, I would just continually get these requests. And when I started the YouTube membership program, I found that those people were the people that were requesting couples therapy. So the only reason why I'm even allocating the time, I love watching that show, but the only reason why I could justify spending the time watching that show is because the paying YouTube members were requesting it, right? So that gives me an ability to prioritize and figure out where I get the most bang for my buck, so to speak. You know what I mean? And, I hate bringing up the money aspect of it, but it's a major part of the conversation for me, in that in order for me to even make this content, I need to be able to generate money from Psychology in Seattle. Because if that doesn't happen, worst case scenario, say revenue just plummets for Psychology in Seattle, I have to go back to my regular career at the university and in my private practice. And I would be spending 50, 60 hours a week doing that. And I would have, only a little bit of time to make content. And so it's a symbiotic relationship. The revenue makes it so I can make the content and make the content better. And I need to figure out how I can make that work so that everyone can so it's a win-win, right? I can win and the audience can win, right? So I'm always trying to figure that out. So I hope you don't mind that I bring up the money aspect, because it's real. It's a real thing. I semi-retired from the university. I drastically shrunk my private practice over time, and I and my family are 99% dependent on you. So, but it's working out. It's not without its anxiety, but things seem to be going okay. And as a part of my decision-making process as to whether or not we would start the YouTube membership program, I had my history with Patreon to learn from, in that in 2015, a listener actually suggested that I start on Patreon. I had never heard of Patreon at that point, and they suggested it. And again, I didn't want to start another account, but I thought, well, I don't know, we'll give it a try. Plus, I don't know if anyone wants to pay money for this kind of thing. We'll see. Maybe it's worth a shot. And so I gave it a shot, and it worked out slowly but surely over time. And what I learned was that as people became patrons, I could scale back in the beginning on my private practice. I never terminated with clients. I just waited for them to naturally terminate with me, and then I wouldn't replace them. So as I was making more money on Patreon, it would justify not taking on other clients because they would offset each other, right? And what that did was it gave me more time. And so I could allocate that time where the money was coming from, which was to make better audio podcast content. As I made better audio podcast content, more people became patrons, and this feedback loop happened. Well, that was a very learning experience, because it's that win-win, right? I win because I'm getting this career shift that I want to do. And the audience is winning because they're getting more quality content, and it's a feedback loop that feeds on each other, right? And with YouTube membership, it could be the same, and it is kind of working out to be that way. Also, there's a built-in mechanism of checks and balances where, let's say, hardly anyone becomes a YouTube member. Well, then that doesn't justify me pulling time away from other things and effort to do that kind of thing, and therefore it won't grow. It is growing, and it has been steadily growing, similar to how Patreon was growing over time, slowly but surely, that kind of thing. And it's this way for me to understand where I should be pointing myself, because again, I want to do it all, but I need to limit myself. And how do I limit? It's sort of like with emails. When I respond to emails, I will prioritize patrons, and I'll prioritize upper tier, middle tier patrons. Not because I want to exclude others, but I just can't answer all the emails. So I need some criterion to follow to know where to allocate my efforts. And it just seems like, it makes sense to do that, most of the time. And the same goes for content now with YouTube. And as more people become YouTube members, then that will inform me as to, okay, in my month of work hours, how do I allocate that time? So it all makes sense. I hope that makes sense. So if you're a patron, you might be thinking, well, how do we benefit from you starting this YouTube membership program? Isn't this just taking time away from the patron activities, the audio podcasts and the deep dives? And that's a viable question, and it was a question I was worried about, and I did not want that to happen. Not only just because I don't think that would be very fair, but also I personally just don't want that to happen. Well, what we found over time was it was actually the opposite. One of the things that I love doing, and I have been struggling to have time to do, is to do deep dives for the audio podcast. I've talked about this before, but one of the things that I lament, how some people have like a bucket list, like, I want to be able to do this, or travel to this country, or I want to climb this mountain. Well, for me, I don't really have anything on that list. All I have are just a bunch of deep dives that I want to do, that I am sad that I know I won't live long enough to be able to do all of them. So I really like doing that kind of thing, and I want to be able to do that. And so what I thought would happen, and what is actually happening, is as I'm scaling back on YouTube and having YouTube members and the income from that make up for the income lost of scaling back on YouTube, overall, I'm spending less time on YouTube, even though the revenue loss isn't as severe as if I didn't have the YouTube membership program, if that makes sense. And so I have found that I have a lot more free time for the deep dives. Also, free time to finish my book on grief, and free time to do chores like put up Stacy's curtains, which I still have yet to do, which is on my list, or go for a walk, or exercise, or visit with my family, or whatever, So deep dives actually are increasing because of the YouTube membership program, in part. And so Stacy and I, after thinking about this for a long time, we decided to launch the YouTube membership program about a year ago. And one of the things that we found was that the audiences were indeed very, very different. When I would poll each audience, I would get a completely different set of requests. On the YouTube membership side, I would get things like couples therapy, or Taylor Swift documentary, or The Little Mermaid, that kind of stuff. Whereas on the Patreon side, I would get a completely different set of requests, like the neo-Nazi deep dive, or Jodi Arias, or Josh Powell, or Elon Musk, or personality disorders. That it was a completely different. Like, there was no overlap. There's overlap between the two audiences, but the requests were completely different. So it really shows that it's two different restaurants and should be considered that way by me. But as we were doing the YouTube membership program, there were two problems. One was that I couldn't keep it straight as to where the exclusive content was going some of the time. And I would post patron stuff for YouTube members, and I would post YouTube member exclusive content for patrons, sometimes because I just would forget, or sometimes people would ask for it and I'd be like, oh, okay. But then other people were like, well, hey, how come we're not getting it? So that was one problem. The other problem was there was just a general constructive complaint, if you will, of people saying, hey, I became a patron because you asked us to become a patron to support your channel on YouTube, and now I have to sign up on YouTube as well. Like, that doesn't seem fair. And yeah, I get that. And that was one of the main reasons why I never started, or it took me so long to start the YouTube membership program. And if you have a situation where you sign up on Patreon only because of the YouTube channel, and you want like a refund or a prorated situation, email us and we'll figure out something. You always want to go through the website. That's the only way that you can contact us. And we've already done things along those lines because it's just fair to do that, right? So in the end, we decided to continue with the policy of having the audio podcast exclusive content only for patrons and the video YouTube exclusive content only for YouTube members. And the reasons for this are 4 reasons. One is to allow me to provide tailored content to each audience. Instead of treating both audiences the same audience, it gives me the ability to tailor that. Also, it gives me the ability to know how to allocate my efforts and my time. Also, it will help to establish a more sustainable work-life balance for myself. I want to be doing this until I'm unable to mentally or physically, which could be, I don't know, hopefully in my 80s. Who knows? I want to be doing this for a long time. And I need to establish some kind of balance moving forward. And the way that I've been doing it, that is not possible. So the YouTube membership program, I think, is one measure to get me to that balance. And it seems to be actually working that way. The 4th reason to separate the content is to keep it clear and fair. Like I was saying earlier, I would forget sometimes, or I would give in because I felt bad, and I would start sharing stuff across the 2 groups, and there would be confusion and people would get upset. And if there's anything I know about these kinds of things, is you have to be clear, and you have to be fair, and you have to stick to it. And the whole reason why I'm making this episode is because I was about to make some content, some exclusive content, and I was thinking, oh, I should really share this with the other group. And so I started to do that, and then I was talking it over with Stacy, and she's like, you can't do that because it's going to be confusing to people, and it's going to set this precedent. So I was like, yeah, that's right. Okay, all right. I need to figure this out for myself. Also, I need to tell people what the final policy is, because we've been playing around with it for a while. So I sat down to write like a quick outline to just insert at the beginning of one of these episodes. And the outline blossomed. And I thought, maybe I should just make an episode about this because there's a lot to get into. And I thought, I'll make this episode and then I hopefully won't have to talk about it again. Because I was thinking, well, if I put it in an exclusive YouTube video or a YouTube video, then the audio podcast audience might not hear that. So I need to make sure I remember to mention it in an audio podcast. How about I just make one episode for everybody, and that'll be that. Okay, so that's the end of that topic. And I want to talk about a tangential topic, which is that we have been filming our audio deep dives, me and Umberto. And we've been doing that because a lot of people want to see us as we're talking. But also, I've gotten better at doing the whole thing. I don't have a producer. And so I have to edit on the fly during the episode. I have to control the cameras. I have to make sure everything is working. And then editing it is a pain in the ass. But I've gotten better. So we've started doing that. And so there will be the patron section of the patron exclusive episodes, the deep dives. And those will be video recorded and edited, by the way, but I haven't been posting them on Patreon. The reason for that, The main reason is that Patreon is really janky when it comes to video. Number one is they do allow video uploads, and they do allow those video uploads to be designated only for patrons. So it's like, well, why don't I just take the full video and just upload it to Patreon and have it made just so that patrons can see it? Well, we don't actually have that ability because Psychology in Seattle, we don't have that ability because when we signed up on Patreon in 2015, there was only one plan, and that plan did not offer video, and the percentage that Patreon takes out is, they say it's like 5%, but really it's more like 12 or 15% what Patreon takes from us. You know, the patrons give us X amount of dollars, and then Patreon will take 12, 15%, something like that. Even though they claim they only take 5%, and then they add on the credit card fees, which are only supposed to be like 2 or 3%. So I don't know how it balloons to 12 or who knows. It's been that way since 2015, and I have looked into it before, and that's just how it is. Anyway, so the plan that we're under, we have been grandfathered in and allowed to keep that plan, but as a consequence, we don't have certain perks. One of those perks is the ability to upload videos. So in order to have the plan that uploads videos, we have to sign up on a different plan that would take maybe double the amount, and that would make it rough for us and for me to pay my bills. Just for one function of uploading videos to Patreon, which is a fairly limited function that we would be using. Now, even though it would cost us extra money to do that, I did consider doing it for that reason, because I really wanted the patrons to be able to watch the full videos. And so there was this period of time where Patreon was like, hey, even for those grandfathered people in, we're going to allow you temporarily to upload videos for your patrons. And so I thought, oh, well, let's give it a shot. So I think it was maybe during the Jodi Arias episodes or maybe the neo-Nazi episodes, I'm not sure. I'll start uploading the full video episode for the patrons. Well, their interface, Patreon, if you don't know, their interface and their technology is so jacked up. There are so many problems. I won't bore you with the details. Stacy deals with a lot of the problems, but ask anyone that uses Patreon, any creator, and they'll tell you, especially recently, that there have just been some atrocious changes to the UI and to the interface and to the technology. So when I would upload a video, it wouldn't work half the time. And even if it did work, it would take hours and hours to upload a video to, especially, we might have a video, a patron episode that could be 2-3 hours long. That's a long video. I would set it and forget it and walk away and wake up the next day and it would be like 50% done. And so it was super janky. So in my head, I'm like, okay, I'm going to double the fee that Patreon is taking from us to get this product that we only use every once in a while, the uploading of a video. And that product is a piece of crap. Now, in the future, I trust that Patreon will iron out those wrinkles and will likely offer to everyone the ability to upload videos. That's my guess. The alternative to using Patreon is to upload to YouTube, which works beautifully. And then you have the episode, what they call unlisted, which means that only people with the URL can see it. And so then you upload the video to YouTube, and then you make it unlisted, and then you take that URL and you put it in Patreon, embed the video, and only patrons would be able to see that post, and then they could watch the full patron exclusive video on Patreon, but it's a video from YouTube. The problem with that is that YouTube has a policy about doing that. They say you can't do that because I think their reasoning is you can't use YouTube as basically like a server for a paywall that benefits someone else. So they have a policy against that. And I don't want to mess around too much with YouTube because I've heard of other channels, other content creators who have messed around with various different things, and YouTube will just delete their channel. And that is terrifying to me to think that it's just like delete. Because of that reason, we at this point can't really viably upload full videos to Patreon, and therefore the video episodes that Berto and I are doing, the deep dives, you can watch the free portion of those episodes on YouTube, and then you have to listen to the rest of the episode on Patreon. I know that's not ideal. I don't think this is the way it's going to be in the future, but it is the way that it is now. And the way that I think about it is that in the past, Umberto and I wouldn't even make video. And so for the old school audio podcast listeners, it's the same. They're still listening to Umberto and I talk. Occasionally there'll be a video clip that we'll watch, but it's not very frequent. And I'm always mindful of explaining what's in the video to people that might be listening to the audio podcast, because that's my priority, is the audio podcast. We just happen to be videotaping it. It's not going in the direction of YouTube. It's just like, it just happens to be videotaped for the few people that care to watch it instead of just listen. All right, so that's the end of my outline. So some closing thoughts are that I want to reassure the patrons that nothing really changes for the patrons. My dedication to the patrons, my dedication to the audio podcast has not changed at all. If anything, I now have more time to dedicate to deep dives and to the audio podcast. I don't know if people have noticed that, but I have personally. We're going to publish our Josh Powell episodes pretty soon. I spent a lot more time on that series than I would have normally, so I feel really good about that. The other thing I want to say is I really love making reaction videos. If I had my druthers, I would do it all day long, but I can't. So the balance is such that moving forward, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue doing what I've been doing this year in 2024 of when Love is Blind is on, then I'll go full hog and I'll be very detailed and I'll post 2 videos a day as fast as I can. And during that time, there'll be a lot more activity, comments, reaction videos, and me in the comment section, and just a lot of activity, a lot of time spent, it's very gratifying. When the season 6 Love is Blind came out, I had already 6 weeks from the beginning of 2024 of scaling back the YouTube channel, which gave me time to do chores and be able to think. And I found that when season 6 started, I had a tremendous amount of enthusiasm and energy for it. As evidenced, I think, by all those episodes on the borderline abuse that I made. I don't know if I would have done that if I was burnt out slightly the way I was before. So I'm still dedicated to do that. Season 7 is supposed to come out later this year, and I'm really looking forward to that. And I don't have any plans to scale back on that. But in between, it's going to be 2 or 3 episodes, free episodes per week. Plus, I'm trying to have at least one YouTube member episode a week as well. And maybe as there's more YouTube members, maybe that'll increase. I don't know. It's hard for me to commit. I'm still trying to figure out what the schedule for the YouTube membership exclusive videos will be, but that's just where we're at right now. And so that, all those things are the plan, and I just want everyone to know that. The other thing I want to say is thank you. If you're watching this to this point, thanks for listening, because I really want people to know what's in my head, and I don't want there to be confusion, and I hope that it makes sense as to why we're doing this. Also, I want to thank people for becoming a YouTube member and or becoming a patron. It means the world to me. I can't even tell you how transformative those people have been in my life. The patrons in particular, because it's been 9 years. Wow, almost 9 years on Patreon. And some people have been patrons for 9 years. They've been patrons the entire time, which, it just gives me chills that people would actually give me money to do this kind of thing, pay my bills for me so that I could spend my time doing this. And I'm living the dream. This is what I wanted to do. I love being a therapist. I love being a professor. And I did that for 25 years. And I now want to prioritize making content. It's the next chapter. You know, the way that I think about it is like when I started out in my career, I was primarily a therapist, and I was working with a very small number of people, the clients, and trying to affect change in that way. Then later in my career, I was more focused on being a professor, and that's kind of zooming out a little bit, right? Because I'm helping a lot of therapists to help a large number of clients. Then now in my career, I'm zooming out even further and talking to the internet, which is a large group of people, right? And it just feels like it makes sense in terms of the progression of my life. And I really love doing this, and I wouldn't be able to do it at all if it weren't for patrons and the YouTube members, and really just everyone clicking on, every time you click on a video or you listen to an audio podcast, every ad that is in the episode, we get a tiny little bit of money, like half a penny or something like that. And that all helps as well. And people that will be kind to me, that gives me the energy, people that, over time, there will be moments where I will feel hurt by a comment or two or an email or three, and I will wrestle with that. And if it gets to be a certain level, then I'll start to talk about it in a video or in an audio podcast. And like in my marriage or in my friendships or in my family, I have found that when I am vulnerable, which is hard for me because I'm more on the avoidance side, things go well for me because one, I'm focusing on my needs, but I'm also signaling to people that I can be hurt and that I am hurt. And then that will provoke people's empathy. Even though they might not agree with me, they care because they're human beings. And so they will reach out, and then I will feel healed. I'll feel secure and safer, and it gives me the fuel. And so when people are like that with me, it gives me, there's a lot of ways one can support and help me to make all this content. The emotional side is just as important as on the monetary side, Also, everyone that emails in and suggests things or asks questions for the audio podcast or whatever, it's just, I'm living the dream, like I said. Every day I wake up and I think, I can't wait to just work. It's so great. It's so meaningful and fulfilling. It's not always easy, but it's so fulfilling and fun. And I get to hang out with friends, and I get to interact with people all over the world, and I get to do various different things. Yeah, it's a great thing. So I just want to thank y'all. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.